Hello, everybody. It is Miss Brett here to take you through the second part of our lecture today, which we just got finished with Miss Floyd explaining the rise of the Democratic Party and how Andrew Jackson came to power, how he mobilized his party base and really started to appeal to commoners. And basically, Andrew Jackson is our old school Jeffersonian Republicans. We talked about how the Republican Party went through drastic changes after the War of 1812 and in the era of good feelings, and how the Republican Party basically became this nationalist, central power, pro industry party. And now we're seeing those lingering old school Jeffersonian Republicans coming back and basically being represented by the Democrat Party. And so when Andrew Jackson came into power, we're seeing this expansion of democracy. We're seeing how commoners and lower class white males are now eligible to vote. And we're definitely seeing how the political structure is changing with Andrew Jackson's presidency. So my part of the lecture, this part two, we're going to focus on three major controversial events of Andrew Jackson. And through Andrew Jackson's presidency, these three very controversial events, Andrew Jackson is going to expand the power of the presidency big time. Before Andrew Jackson, the president was seen as the executive branch that had major checks from Congress, really seeing Congress as the true leaders of the government and had all the power. But Andrew Jackson is going to transform the power of the presidency and really expand the power of the executive branch. So we're going to talk about three major topics today. And the first one we're going to talk about is with the Native Americans and the issues over the Trail of Tears. Now, a lot of people think Andrew Jackson's responsible for the Trail of Tears, and in a way he is, but he actually wasn't even president during it. So we're going to talk about the context of the Trail of Tears and how this event unfolds and why Andrew Jackson is the one that gets the blame/credit for this event. So, starts off with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed by Congress, this law that basically said that Native Americans had to move west of the Mississippi River. So basically, Native Americans, all of the Native Americans east, the Chickasaws, the Cherokee, the Seminoles, all of these natives had to go west. And for the most part, they were being forced into Oklahoma, which was Indiana territory. So not only were they being forced to give up their territory, give up their land, they were being thrown into the United States' worst piece of real estate. Sorry, I'm a Longhorn. So with the Indian Removal Act, we see that Native Americans, for the most part, obviously resisted this. But why are the Democrats pushing this? Well, remember, the Democrats were pro-agriculture. They wanted to expand agriculture. And so there's all this very fertile land in the South that could be used for cotton production and basically seen as a barrier to the U.S. cotton explosion that was happening. And so the Indian Removal Act, the context of it, why it's being passed, is really because of the fact that the agrarian vision of the Democrats. Now, with the Indian Removal Act, but for the most part, most tribes reluctantly moved. Obviously not happy about it, but reluctantly they left and they went to Oklahoma. However, some tribes, especially like the Seminoles and the Cherokee, refused to leave. They refused to give up their land. And so with the issue of this, as the resistance rises, especially with the Cherokee in Georgia, Georgia tries to pass laws that are going to try to push the Cherokee out. And as Georgia passes laws on the Cherokee Nation, this eventually ends up going to the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia. Now, Worcester versus Georgia, John Marshall is still the Chief Justice. We talked about John Marshall since Jefferson. John Marshall is still in the Supreme Court, and basically the Supreme Court, Worcester versus Georgia, there is a lawsuit about Georgia state laws and their power over Cherokee, the Cherokee Nation and the Cherokee tribe. So With this, it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of the natives. With Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the natives. And their argument, basically, it says in Congress, the branch of Congress, it says in the Constitution that Congress has the authority over foreign treaties and with foreign countries and tribes. So it basically said that the U.S. national government, Congress, is the only one that has authority to handle disputes or handle relations with foreign countries and tribes. So the Constitution clearly states that state governments do not have authority over tribes. That's the national government's power. So when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the natives, we see that Andrew Jackson gets quite upset about this ruling. And Andrew Jackson actually told the state of Georgia that they don't have to listen to the Supreme Court. Think about this. The President of the United States is telling the state of Georgia that they don't have to listen to the ruling. They can ignore it. And Andrew Jackson ignored it. He is going to allow Georgia to push the Cherokee and force them out of Georgia. Now, when the national government, thinking of our Constitution, the Constitution of the United States, where we have a clear set of checks and balances, that is a fundamental component of the Constitution, where the Congress, the Supreme Court, and the President all have powers over each other to prevent a king from being formed. And here Andrew Jackson is defying the Supreme Court, not listening to the Supreme Court, and this has never happened before, and we don't know how to respond to it. And for the most part, nobody does. Nobody stands up to Andrew Jackson or the threats that he pushed on the U.S. Constitution. Now, while the state of Georgia is going to push and try to get the Cherokee Nation out of Georgia, eventually this is going to lead to what we call the Trail of Tears. Now, the Trail of Tears was in 1838. The Trail of Tears was in 1838, and this is actually after Andrew Jackson left office. The president at the time was his vice president, Martin Van Buren. Now, Andrew Jackson is the one who gets the blame for the Trail of Tears because of the fact that the Jacksonian presidency basically laid the foundation, laid the framework, and laid the basically kind of set the precedent that it's okay to remove the natives. And so the Trail of Tears in 1838, the natives were physically forced from their homeland. The U.S. Army was sent in, and the U.S. Army pushed the Cherokee out of Georgia. And we can see in this map here, had to literally walk, had to move themselves. And obviously with children, with elderly, this ends up being an event that was detrimental and extremely harmful to the Native Americans. There's an estimate of around 4,000 Cherokee that died in this Trail of Tears. And when we think about that, you know, the issues that we see in the United States, even to this day, of what people value more, right? Andrew Jackson and the Democrats valued cotton more than human rights and human lives. And so we see this debate happening all the time about what is more valuable, right? Where we debate money versus humanity versus equality. And so with the Native Americans and with this event, it's definitely left a stain on Jackson's presidency. Even Andrew Jackson was voted to be removed from the $20 bill because of this event. Now, with his defying of the Supreme Court, we're starting to see Andrew Jackson is trying to use his power, and he's trying to gain power. He's definitely promoting his power. And we're seeing with the Trail of Tears and with Worcester versus Georgia, Andrew Jackson disregards checks and balances. Okay. So the next event that crisis we have is the nullification crisis, and this is another very extremely controversial event that happens in 1832. Now, 1832 is a pretty important year because 1832 is Andrew Jackson's re-election year. So remember, Andrew Jackson got elected in 1828, and he's going to be running for re-election in 1832 in the midst of this event, okay? So let's talk about tariffs. Tariffs we have been talking about since Alexander Hamilton's economic plan. Then Henry Clay created the American system, and we saw the tariff of 1816. And if you listen to Miss Floyd's lecture, you know that Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay do not get along. And so tariffs specifically help American industry, okay? For example, if you had a t-shirt that was $10 made in America, right? It's $10. And then you had a shirt from Great Britain that was $10. The tariff is going to add a cost to the British shirt. So now the British shirt is $12. So if you're in the store and you see a shirt for 10 and a shirt for 12, clearly you're going to go with the cheaper one, right? So more Americans are buying American goods, and that's helping American businesses boost. Now, the problem is if you are the business and you have the $10 shirt and there's a $12 shirt, you're going to take your shirt and maybe raise it to $11.50. The price of American goods are going up because of tariffs. So the problem is the South hates tariffs because the South has to rely on the North for manufactured goods. The South is basically cotton. There is nothing in any form that protects the Southern cotton. The U.S. government has not done anything to protect U.S. cotton, but the U.S. government is using tariffs to promote and protect industry in the North. And so the South has always felt bullied by these tariffs, that it's basically a promotion of the North and it's a promotion of industry. So the tariff of 1816 has slowly been creeping up. It's getting higher and higher and higher. And as the tariff gets more expensive, the price of American goods also go up because foreign goods are getting more expensive. So we see tariffs rising. And in 1828, tariffs have risen so much that the South actually calls this the tariff of abomination, that it keeps going up. And the South is just being ignored, that the South is just basically feels like they're being bullied. The U.S. government is doing nothing for the South and for cotton. So as tariffs are going up, we see the South eventually calls this the tariff of abomination in 1828. Now, in 1828, that's when Jackson got elected. So when he comes in, we already see the South being frustrated by these tariffs. Now, as the tariffs are getting worse, Andrew Jackson, when he first got elected, his first vice president was this man here, John C. Calhoun. And John C. Calhoun came up with a nullification theory. John C. Calhoun came up with this nullification theory. And he basically said that the state government has the right to decide whether or not to obey a national law. Let me repeat that. The state government has the right to decide whether or not to follow and obey a national law. So, thinking about this dates back. We've seen this attempt before, especially from Jefferson. This is kind of like the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, when Virginia and Kentucky refused to follow the Alien and Sedition Acts. They said the state government is ignoring them. They're nullifying them. And here we see John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, arguing that states do not have to follow national law. And with the nullification theory, again, this is a theory about who has more power, the state government or the national government. Well, with this nullification debate and with this nullification theory, we actually end up seeing it getting debated on Congress floor. And we actually end up seeing it getting debated in the Senate. And we had two major senators that are going to really push the opposing and supporting sides of this nullification theory. And this ends up getting called the Webster-Haney debate. So let's talk about these two senators. Well, Daniel Webster basically said nullification is illegal. Basically, Daniel Webster, he's a senator. He is saying that nullification is not allowed. You cannot nullify national laws. That is the power of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the power to nullify national law or determine it unconstitutional. So basically, Daniel Webster is saying that the United States cannot stay together or cannot be one country if every state can just go off and do whatever they want. Okay. And especially Daniel Webster's response, he's basically saying that if states can do whatever they want, what happens if the national government bans something? Especially think about slavery. If the national government eventually abolishes slavery and state governments can nullify it, what's the purpose of national law? And it's actually interesting because when Webster made his argument on the Senate floor, that rhetoric was actually incorporated into Lincoln's inaugural address a few years later from this. Now, on the other side, Robert Haney was a senator from the South. And Robert Haney basically argued that nullification is the only way to protect the South. Haney is arguing that nullification is the only way to protect the South. Like, this is the only thing the South can do because the North refuses to, or the national government refuses to help the South. They're only helping the North and they're only helping industry. So through this nullification theory, we see both sides. We see arguments for both sides, but it doesn't actually come to full swing until 1832. The nullification crisis is in 1832 when Congress once again increased the tariff. And the tariff of 1832 was the highest tariff up until this time. And when Congress increased the tariff in 1832, we end up seeing the nullification theory be put into practice. So this is like the precursor to the Civil War. We see states literally just lose it. And what ends up happening with the nullification crisis, when we see the tariff go up again, Vice President John C. Calhoun resigned. Think about this. The Vice President of the United States is so angry at the national government that he resigned. He went back to his home state in South Carolina to basically initiate nullification. So when he goes back to his home state in South Carolina, he is going to push nullification through South Carolina's government. And we end up seeing South Carolina declare that they will not be collecting the tariff of 1832. They will not collect it. They're not following it. So now Andrew Jackson's in this weird space because, one, his vice president just quit to pretty much wage war against the national government. But Andrew Jackson, think about his beliefs, think about his ideologies. He's a Democrat. He's pro-state rights. But now he's being challenged. His government, the national government's being challenged and his power is being challenged. So with the nullification crisis, Andrew Jackson feels it's necessary to do something to basically shut down South Carolina. They end up getting passed through Congress a force bill. This is when basically they do this very quickly. A force bill was passed through Congress that allowed the president to use military to collect the tariff. So with the force bill, Andrew Jackson can now send the military to South Carolina to force them to pay the tariff. So we literally see a civil war about to start based off of tariffs. And as the military is heading to South Carolina, we end up finally getting a resolution in Congress. And guess who our great compromiser is? Good old Henry Clay. Henry Clay, who settled the Missouri Compromise. He's going to keep on being there to handle other compromises. Henry Clay steps in as the hero. And again, Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson are enemies, right? Like in the video we watched, Jackson's two biggest regrets were not shooting Calhoun and hanging Henry Clay. With Henry Clay, he steps in Congress and he settles a compromise. And basically the resolution, Henry Clay ends up negotiating and they lower the tariff back to what it was in 1816. His tariff, right? This is his tariff in Clay's American system. So Henry Clay's resolution is they lower the tariff of abomination back to what it was in 1816 when Clay came up with the American system, and it caused South Carolina to feel basically appeased, like they were okay, they settled. And so with that, we end up seeing the fact that Andrew Jackson had to enforce his power as in the national government. We see Henry Clay kind of being the savior that settles this dispute, but we really see how divided the United States is. Like North and South is extremely divided economically, and there are definitely hard feelings in the South about how the national government just does not support them. So with that being said, we definitely see this crisis happening, unfolding during an election, okay? Now, afterwards, we have another event, same year in 1832, the last major controversial event of Andrew Jackson's presidency. And so with that, we end up getting the Bank War. Now, the Bank War, again, this is in 1832. So back to Henry Clay and his American system. We already had a crisis over his tariffs. Now we're going to have a crisis over Clay's bank. Remember, Clay started the second bank of the United States, and we definitely see Andrew Jackson, the mortal enemy of Henry Clay, is going to definitely be opposed to this bank. So the Bank of the United States was led and organized and managed by this man here. This is Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle is going to be the manager of the Second Bank of the United States. But the Bank of the United States, it's privately owned. It gets federal deposits, federal funding. And again, most people, especially Southerners, feel that the bank only supports the interests of the North. It's only benefiting industries in the North, and basically that it only had interest for the wealthy. Ultimately, Nicholas Biddle and the bank were seen as an elitist, one-sided, kind of like a corrupt institution that only supported the North and industry. So the bank was up for recharter in 1836. So remember we talked about how the first bank died. It didn't get renewed because most things have expiration dates. Well, the second bank has an expiration date, and it's in 1836, okay? The bank is not up for recharter to revote and either keep it or lose it until 1836. Well, it's 1832, and it's an election year. And Andrew Jackson is going to be running against Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay in Congress felt this is an opportunity to destroy Jackson. And Henry Clay ends up moving the recharter to 1832. He basically says, let's vote on it now. I mean, it's 4 years down the road. Clay is specifically doing this to try to hurt Jackson's campaign. So Clay is going to get Congress to move the vote to recharter the bank in 1832, 4 years ahead of the schedule. Well, the bank easily gets rechartered in 1832 by Congress, but it has to get signed by the president. So this bill gets pushed through Congress, and it's now sitting on Andrew Jackson's desk. And Andrew Jackson, who hates the bank, hates Henry Clay, Andrew Jackson decides to veto the bank. And when he decided to veto the bank, we end up seeing this veto be a very powerful stance on the U.S. Constitution. So the veto originally was supposed to be about vetoing laws that are like unethical or found unconstitutional by the president. But Andrew Jackson uses his veto power to get rid of things that he just does not like. He vetoed more than all the presidents before him combined. He used his veto power. And when he vetoed it, he really had good arguments. He explained that the bank was elitist. It only benefited the North. It did not help all of America. And when he had this very strong, compelling argument that he was basically there to help the South and help the Westerners, and he gave this veto message that we're going to analyze in documents in your writing guide, Andrew Jackson actually benefited big time from this veto. Because remember, now commoners have more rights to vote. The lower class is now able to vote. And so when he made the compelling arguments that the bank only helps the wealthy, the lower class was listening. The lower class saw this as him defending the common man. So with that veto, he is using his veto power to expand his power and the executive branch. But look how it affects him in the election of 1832. He wins by a landslide. And Henry Clay, who we talk about a lot these couple units, loses big time. And so we see that this veto actually ends up helping Andrew Jackson because he's sticking up for the common man. Now, the power of the president obviously getting stronger with the fact that he's defying the Supreme Court, he's using his veto power, he's using the military to enforce tariffs. But here's where things get a little questionable. He vetoed the recharter for the bank, but the bank still has 4 years left, right? The bank's not set to expire until 1836. And so with it being set to expire in 1836, it still has 4 years left. Well, Andrew Jackson basically said that he wanted to kill the bank now. He doesn't want it to go on for 4 more years. Well, does he have the right to do that? No one stopped him. And it's actually ironic because he wanted to basically remove all the money from the national bank. He wanted to take out all the money. And so he ended up asking his Secretary of Treasury, remove the money. And his Secretary of Treasury refused to. He said, Mr. President, that's not okay. That's not allowed. Secretary of Treasury got fired. He then went through multiple secretary, I think he went through 3 until he finally found a secretary that would do what he wanted. So think about this. The President of the United States is using his power and actually expanding his power because the president doesn't really have the ability to do this, but he did it anyway. In 1832, he ends up killing the Bank of the United States 4 years before it's supposed to, and he took out all the money from the national bank and basically distributed it to state pet banks. These pet banks, these state banks are going to get all the money from the national government. It's going to all be dispersed into state pet banks, and we are going to see this be very questionable about Andrew Jackson's character. So we end up seeing that in the 1832 election, major landslide victory for Andrew Jackson, very easy victory for Andrew Jackson, but there's a lot of debate about Andrew Jackson's power. And we end up seeing people, if you look at this cartoon, and we're going to analyze this heavily next class, this cartoon think about what this is saying about Andrew Jackson. Think about his challenges to the separation of powers and to our checks and balances. Think about him overstepping the power of the Supreme Court, using his veto power relentlessly, basically expanding his power so much that people are starting to refer to him as King Andrew, a monarch. Okay. So with that, because so many people are seeing Andrew Jackson as becoming way too powerful, way too authoritarian, we end up seeing the rise of another party that is going to rise up to try to resist Andrew Jackson's power. And this party is the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party is basically going to come out in the 1830s. And ultimately, the reason why the Whig Party forms is because they hate Andrew Jackson. That is really the only thing they have in common. So the Whig Party was led by what we call the Great Triumvirate. And the Great Triumvirate, the three leaders of the Whig Party, let's go through them. This one here is Daniel Webster. Webster, who basically said nullification is wrong, nullification is not okay. Daniel Webster is one of the Great Triumvirate. Obviously, Andrew Jackson's two mortal enemies now, Henry Clay, who is pro-industry, pro-North, pro-national government, and John C. Calhoun, his former vice president, who is pro-South, pro-states' rights, pro-agriculture. So these men came together, complete opposites, to form the Whig Party simply because they hate Andrew Jackson. And that is the only thing they have in common. So they do not have a very strong, united guideline or base or framework. They only hate Andrew Jackson, and that's all they have in common. So their party is going to be a little unorganized and a little difficult to lead. Now, in 1836, after Andrew Jackson was done with his 2 terms, his good old friend, Martin Van Buren, his now vice president, is going to run in 1836. And so in 1836 election, we see some craziness, right? 3 Whigs. And it's because the Whigs were unorganized. They did not have a clear platform. But if you put 3 Whigs up, obviously they're going to split each other's vote. And the Democrat, Martin Van Buren, is going to win. Now, Martin Van Buren, yes, the best sideburns in U.S. history. But Martin Van Buren is going to come in as the Democrat. And honestly, Martin Van Buren's presidency is pretty much occupied by the Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 is really America's first major economic downfall. Yes, we had the Panic of 1819 where we saw some stress. We saw an economic hiccup. But 1837 was very severe. And a lot of the issues, pet banks were over speculating land out west. They were loaning too much. We also saw that because of the national bank, when Andrew Jackson took all the money out of the national bank, it really caused the economy to kind of go wonky. I always say that the economy is on a balance beam, and the littlest thing could just knock it off. And so when the national bank died, it really caused an issue with the distribution of funds. We see it caused an economic panic. And so Martin Van Buren's presidency was really occupied by the Panic of 1837. And unfortunately, it was not really overcome for a few years. And he only ended up having 1 term in office. And it's because the Whigs finally got organized. So in 1840, we see the rise of what we call the Log Cabin Campaign. And this was led by none other than William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was the general in the Battle of Tippecanoe. He actually was nicknamed Old Tippecanoe. That's what his motto was. And that's actually, they made a great song. If you've ever seen Parks and Rec, there's actually an episode where they have Old Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They sing it, and it's wonderful. And so the Log Cabin Campaign basically is going to, William Henry Harrison is going to use the methods that the Democrats use. They are going to appeal to commoners. The log cabin campaign, we're going to see campaigning change dramatically. The Whigs are going to use parades. They're going to have picnics and barbecues. They're going to have these mass meetings to have people come out and appeal to just everyday people. They basically stole the Democrats' whole framework of the common man. Now, in 1840, when William Henry Harrison ran for office, he ran with Zachary Tyler. And when John Tyler, when John Tyler ran with him as vice president, and William Henry Harrison and John Tyler came into office, they were the first Whigs. Okay. And we can see kind of divided some interesting components of the map here, but William Henry Harrison wins the 1840 election with the log cabin campaign, our first Whig president. But unfortunately, William Henry Harrison gave an extremely long inaugural address out in the snow, caught a pneumonia, and ended up dying 1 month later. William Henry Harrison is our shortest lived president. He ends up dying 1 month later, and his VP, John Tyler, comes into office. And just to show you how unorganized the Whigs were, their platform not clear, John Tyler, by the time he ran for re-election, he switched back to the Democrat Party. So we definitely see the Whigs were not very organized. We definitely see in the end, the Democrats increase the power of the national government. We definitely see the transformation of the U.S. politics happening. But with this, we are left with the Democrats and the Whigs and kind of an unclear platform. So with that being said, we finish up today with Andrew Jackson, one of our more controversial presidents based off of some of these events between the Trail of Tears, the nullification crisis, and the bank war. All right. Thank y'all. See you next class.